Good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. My name is Doug Brunke. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Chamber. This is an important topic we've got today, cybersecurity adaptation by SMBs. The big companies already have it. Most of them do, or a lot of them do, probably insufficient in many cases. SMBs have been slower to the table and very often have not considered the risks involved. So we not only have the presentation today, but we have a series of presentations for SMBs, small and medium-sized businesses, to be able to adapt what is going to help protect you as a small or medium-sized business. It is important. There are things happening around the world at an accelerated pace. AI is unfortunately, in this case, contributing negatively to the negative impact on small and medium-sized businesses. But I have good news. Kian Williams is here today, and Franz Muissen is here to be our moderator and facilitator. And these two fellows, Kian and Franz, are a dynamic team who both know and care about businesses and how to protect them. So, gentlemen, Franz, I turn the program over to you. Thank you for the thought process that you've gone through of protecting companies and sharing now the information today and ongoing to be able to have them be as successful as they can be, global and unstoppable. I introduce you, Franz, please.
Hello, everybody around the world. It's a pleasure to participate in this series. My name is Frans Meeuwis, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. I am a business development consultant by trade, helping startups and scale-ups enter new market segments, whether it's geographic or vertical, and in particular, companies in technology, and there again, companies focusing on cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is indeed a topic that is increasing in importance. It's always been important, but now the risks are being amplified and a little bit more felt around the industries as a result of global tensions, but also because of the stakes and the opportunities. And with that, I would like to pass the virtual microphone to Keyan so that Keyan can introduce himself as well.
Thank you, Franz. Ladies and gentlemen around the world, it's a pleasure to be able to present to so many people in so many places, whether you're listening live or listening to the recording. I am known as a security person. My real work for the past couple of years has been focused on governance and management of enterprise risk. So, from a global perspective, enterprise risk includes security, it's not limited to security. And what Franz and I hope to do in this series, starting with this session today, is to highlight some of the enterprise practices that can be tailored and molded to support small and medium businesses. One of the benefits of this conversation, if you think about the difference between an enterprise organization and a small and medium business, usually small businesses are making less than $50 million in revenue per year, but that's a lot of businesses. And then medium businesses are between 50 million and $1 billion per year. And so we're not talking about a small market in a community, but we're talking about the engine behind the global economy. Most of those organizations don't receive good service when we're talking about technology and cybersecurity solutions that reduce risk. So the conversation that Franz and I are having in 2026 in this segment and in the 5 that follow is designed to provide valuable information for the leaders of those companies to put them in a good position to protect themselves, their livelihood, their customers, and everybody that depends on them.
Okay, and thank you, Kian. And then just to add to that, these conversations are open to the participants in the audience. Please feel free to post your questions and thoughts in the chats. We will address them intermittently through the conversations or at the end, depending on the format of the event. Some of our events will be conversations. We will have guest speakers involved on it, and we will delve into technology as well as process applications. So it will be a varied program that we have for the next couple of months. with a variety of participants and indeed discussions, conversations, presentations, anything focusing on helping you assess your risks and your opportunities and your solutions more cohesively. With that, Heian, today we decided to focus on one of the entry points of risk management, compliance, which is one of those elements that organizations first encounter when they have to start thinking about cybersecurity risk, a starting point to assess their cybersecurity. With that in mind, what is your understanding of what is compliance from a cybersecurity perspective? An open question.
Yeah, compliance is an interesting activity. Um, One thing that I didn't mention in my introduction, but I think is relevant for the conversation, is that I do have some background as a university professor. From that background, I often try to take the Socratic approach or look as broadly at the topic as possible. I provide that information because compliance is interesting in the sense that most regulatory frameworks define the minimum standard by which everybody influenced by the regulation has to operate. And so if we take the payment card industry data security standard, it's a contractual agreement that has the enforcement of a regulation. If you don't follow the practices, then you can't process credit card transactions. For small and medium businesses in a global marketplace, it would be detrimental to your operations because I can't run a global organization without being able to process credit card transactions. And so my compliance or my alignment with the requirements of the standard becomes extremely important as a minimum requirement for doing business. Nevertheless, there are numerous organizations that have had cybersecurity incidents or breaches of personal information that were compliant with the payment card standard, but still had problems. And so I think one thing that's important to consider about compliance is that it is a minimum standard for operations within the industry. It is not the thing that's going to cause your organization to be able to manage risk, maintain it at an acceptable level. Additional investment, additional effort, additional controls are required beyond whatever minimum obligations you have from the laws that affect your company based on where you're located, based on how you operate, and based on how you do business.
Excellent. And so with that in mind, if you are compliant, well, actually, let me ask this first question. Is there a difference in compliance for small, medium businesses as there is for bigger companies? And is there also a difference in industries and or is it all the same for all organizations, regardless of size and industry?
Well, what ends up happening, Franz, and a lot of people are going to be familiar with this, you have a matrix of obligations. And so if based on the country that you're in, and then the state for countries that have states, and then the county, and then the city, just from a just from a municipal perspective, for state and local businesses, you have multiple requirements. If we use me as an example, I live in the metropolitan Atlanta area, so I am subject to Georgia regulations based on the Secretary of State. I'm subject to Atlanta regulations because I do business. I'm subject to the county that I live in because of where my business is based. And so I have local city regulations, I have county regulations, I have state regulations, and that's just for the state of Georgia. Then, at a national perspective, I have regulations. And then, based on the industry that I operate in, my company is a managed service firm that does business consulting. But then there are expectations for how we protect personal information, how we protect confidential digital information. And so, just from this conversation, I can think of 20 regulations that I'm subject to just for me to do compliance. Then I
Yeah.
expand that to some of our global customers. And I met with a customer in Oman this morning. Everything that I do for that customer in Oman is subject to the Omani regulations for privacy, for cybersecurity, for data protection. The same thing applies if we go to Europe. We have NIS2. We have the General Data Protection Regulation. We have the EU AI Act. The farther you go and the more expansive your business, the more complex the regulations that you're subject to become.
That's fantastic. And so one of the big takeaways that I always have for myself is that this can quickly become very overwhelming or at least daunting. You know, first of all, being able to find out what regulations you have to comply with, and then making sure that you are not missing any, and then managing it. It is a cost because it is a use of time. Um, so there is directly an inherent hesitation for businesses to comply because smaller businesses, of course, can struggle with the costs associated with being compliant and with the oversight and with being on top of all those regulations. Now, that is just a mere observation, but then one of the other questions that I often hear is that there's a difference in regards to the objective of compliance, the compliance for data protection, for privacy, or the compliance for data protection with an eye on digital security. Now, is it in your experience, is that a struggle that organizations have to navigate as well? You know, I hear it that organizations say that when they are compliant, even with all the myriad of regulations, that they therefore are safe and secure.
Well, I don't think compliance is ever going to provide any measure of safety because regulations usually trail the reality that businesses are facing. If we look in the United States as an example, the Privacy Act in the United States was signed in the 1970s. And so 40, almost 50 years have passed since the US Privacy Act was implemented as a legislation. And because it is a national regulation, updates and amendments to the Privacy Act take a lot of time. It takes a lot of deliberation. It requires consensus from people in Congress in the United States who are at odds with each other. So even if it makes sense, if one party proposes it, the other party has an obligation to reject it based on the way that our political parties work. And it applies to the United States, but it's not unique to the United States. I know in the United Kingdom, there are some interesting political things going on. There are interesting political things going on in different countries in South America, in the continent of Africa, across their countries, and even in Southeast Asia, which are places that I'm familiar with. I think the priority for small and medium businesses is to have an inventory of all of your obligations. You know, what is everything that we must do based on a documented law, someplace that we operate? What ends up happening once you have that inventory is you can identify areas of requirement where you have synergies and areas of requirement where you have conflicts. Privacy is a good example of that. You know, data protection is pretty straightforward until you start getting into protection of personal information because the EU and GDPR define privacy differently than the United States, who defines it differently than Canada, who defines it differently than Brazil, who defines it differently than China. And so every time you go to a different jurisdiction, while most privacy regulations globally are based on the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the interpretation nationally is different and it's going to have different requirements. So, in a privacy sense, you may have information about customers in France that is maintained in France based on the location. And then you have a different repository for people in Germany. And then you have a different repository that is in Canada for people in Canada. And then you have a different repository for information related to people in Brazil, because I brought them up earlier. And now you're taking a location based strategy to comply with regulations for personal information. You might still have a uniform process for cybersecurity across your entire global organization. So something like the information security management system that you get from the International Organization for Standardization, ISO 27000 defines a unified program that applies to the whole company, even if I have individual privacy programs based on the specific country that we're collecting personal information in. But again, it comes back down to, do I know everywhere that I operate? Do I understand my business processes? Do I understand the obligations related to those operations and business processes so that where it makes sense, I can have one program that solves many problems. And on the other hand, where it makes sense, I can have distinct programs that satisfy unique requirements in specific locations.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's easy. It directly becomes so complex, and or at least a lot of moving parts to keep track of and address. And tying that again into the SMB market space, which is actually quite large, not only in the size but also in range. Anything from a company making, or earning 100,000 to 50 million. So some companies on the higher end of revenue will have the ability to hire data specialists and CIOs and CISOs and whatnot, but the smaller ones do not necessarily. Um, so for the smaller organizations, in your experience, how do they normally tackle this or get on top of all the requirements and the data security issues?
Yeah, what tends to happen is that any business, regardless of size, started off with no plan. I have a great idea. I'm going to start to acquire technology that allows me to advance that idea and deliver it to customers at scale. And then once you hit a certain point in the lifetime of the business, there's some catalyst, either an audit finding or an issue, or just some enterprising person is focusing on operational efficiency. And they say, hey, let's go back and document formally all of our business processes, all of our risks, so that we intimately understand the organization. But almost no company starts with a well defined collection of business processes. No company starts with the Lean Six Sigma and having business process model and notation for how everything works. And the process, because very few companies started with a rigorous program, could become very difficult because you have data in multiple cloud repositories, you have data in multiple data centers. Some people even have data on a computer under the desk of an employee that's not even under the control of the company. And what tends to happen, whether it's a small business, a medium business, or an enterprise organization, is that the leaders of the business, the owner of the company, the board of directors, if the company is larger, has to make a decision that it's in our best interest as an organization and it's in the best interest of our stakeholders to get a handle on everything, to understand what exists, where does it exist, and what is the risk for the answer to those questions. That then starts to cause companies to either hire full-time staff for compliance management, technology management, cybersecurity, and risk management, or they can hire consultants. Part of my business isn't consulting. I'm not selling a solution because this is a presentation for the Global Chamber family, but consulting is very common. There are a lot of experts who have experience in multiple areas, and this is actually beneficial for small and medium businesses. If you do some research and you understand your specific outcome that you want to produce, there is probably a number of provider companies where consultants can come in and help you solve a problem. Even when I was on the board of directors for a large organization, we brought outsiders in as consultants to do strategic planning with the organization so that we can set the direction for the future. We had the capability internally, but an outside perspective allowed us to accelerate the process. So for that company where we realized good outcomes for strategic planning, I think the same kind of approach can work for small and medium businesses where you identify an expert, you verify his or her credentials and qualifications, and then you work with that expert to start to solve, in this context, security, privacy, and technology issues that could have an impact on the business and the way that you operate, especially because about two-thirds of small and medium businesses that have a cybersecurity incident or a data breach cease to exist within 18 months of the public disclosure. And so it's not just about doing this for the sake of doing this. I care about compliance because it's part of my profession, but compliance isn't my driver. A significant number of small and medium businesses go out of business because they didn't plan in advance. They didn't do things that would prevent a cybersecurity incident or a data breach. And then when it happens, they've lost their customer confidence and their customers go to another provider who can deliver the same services. All the planning that we're talking about is a good strategy to avoid the demise of your company by investing a little bit in planning in advance.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I like that. Because indeed, if you're an SMB and you're looking at the complexity of compliance and security, you're looking at how much time it takes and therefore how much it costs and the great black box of unknowns. That it is actually easy to skip on the what not. What if you don't do it? What is the cost of that? And the cost of that is always bigger than the cost of doing it. So based on that, what is a good starting point? You already touched into that, but say that you're going down this route. If you're an SMB and you're looking at whether you're doing it internally or with the aid of a consultant or a hybrid approach, where do you really start in your road to discovery and compliance?
Yeah, I think there's a easy way to start that really boils down to three objectives. Objective number one, you want to document all of your critical business processes. I put emphasis on critical because numerous businesses do thousands of things, but maybe out of those thousands of things, maybe only 100 things are
Yeah.
critical to the success of the business. The formal practice, if you talk about it in a larger context, is just business impact analysis. What do I do? How do I do it? What's the impact on the business if this thing goes away? And what it does is it allows you to define how frequently do I need to do backups of my data? What countermeasures do I put in place so that if some technology fails, we have a backup plan so that we can continue the business? It would be prohibitively expensive to back up 100% of the data in a company and have the capability to restore 100% of the technology in the company. So the business impact analysis becomes extremely critical because it allows you to identify what are the most important things for the business. Step number two, once you've identified the most important things for the business, it does become very beneficial to document how do these most important things work. Most people that use technology don't understand how technology works. But if we're planning for the resilience of the business, especially when we're talking about small and medium businesses that don't have significant resources, the answer to how this works can't be that, well, I depend on Anthropic to do this special agentic AI process, but the process generates 85% of your revenue and you don't know how it works. Because sometimes if you lose your access to technology, there's a manual approach that allows you to continue the business until you can recover the technology. But if you don't understand how the technology works and you don't understand how the process works, then you're not in a good position to support resilience, which is an important business outcome for a business of any size. The third item, it really comes down to gap assessment. If I've identified what I have and I identified how it works, and my objective is to maximize resilience for the most important things within the organization, well, I need to have some kind of plan that says this is the time frame that we can operate without critical systems, services, applications, or data. Based on that time frame, this is the reasonable resilience plan so that we can either, if I'm working in Google Cloud, how long does it take to recover our operations in Microsoft Cloud? And as our application portable so that we can move from Google to Microsoft or from Microsoft to Google, as an example. What tends to happen is that a lot of companies don't think about how do I continue my operations in a different way that produces the same result, which is why numerous companies go out of business after a natural disaster. Imagine that there is a flood, the server that you have in your office goes away, you didn't have a backup copy of any of that data, and you didn't write down how the server was built. You just strung it together with duct tape and bubble gum. Over a decade, it was generating a lot of revenue, but you didn't really understand the underlying processes. Really understanding the underlying processes is specifically what gives you the opportunity to bring back from the dead, in a digital sense, the technology that you're using to run the business. It's not really a cybersecurity issue as much as it is a resilience issue. Cybersecurity could be the reason that something goes out, but it could also be a rainstorm. It could be a tsunami. There have been multiple tsunamis in the news. in the last couple of months, or it could just be a server outage because Microsoft and Google have both had major cloud cloud infrastructure outages that stopped businesses from running. Most enterprise companies know how to recover everything. Many small and medium businesses have never even considered it. And so this is a good opportunity to start that process. What do I have? What's important? How do I recover it? And then that becomes the foundations of a good plan to put something in place to continue the business, regardless of the cause of an outage.
Yeah, that's excellent. So earlier we touched upon the cost of compliance and the cost of not being compliant. But here you also identified the resilience aspect, which is both a cost and a revenue element. You know, the cost of lost business, but also the revenue of continued business. And what I like about that is that it puts compliance and cybersecurity into a place of business continuity, the resilience aspect, but also as a protector of indeed revenue. You know, it cannot be, it just cannot be stressed enough, because if you're looking at compliance as a cost factor, you're only touching on half of the benefit of compliance. You know, just yes, it costs, but it really impacts revenue. So it's an engine in that way, and therefore when organizations, in my experience, when organizations are aware of it, they are able to assess their compliance efforts and data security efforts into a cost benefit analysis. And that helps them manage it and put it into their budgets and give it the proper place in an organization.
Yeah, I like cost benefit analysis as a risk assessment tool. I think one of the things that becomes important is you have to put the costs and the benefits in the right context. And so, Franz, as you were talking, I had the inspiration to break out my calculator. And so, if we say that we're talking about a $50 million business, and we divide $50 million by 365, just to account for every day in a year, what the calculator says is that this $50 million business is generating $136,986 per day. Most cybersecurity incidents, when they happen, take 30, 60, or 90 days to recover, depending on the significance of the incident. And to keep the math simple, if we do rounding, for a $50 million business, if I'm down for a week, I've lost almost $1 million. I could have skipped the calculator
Yeah.
because we're just dividing 50 million by 50 weeks, but I wanted to really bring the point home with specific numbers. If I'm down for 7 days in a $50 million company, I'm losing $958,000 or $958,902 per week. And again, the average downtime with an incident, depending on the size and the scope and the significance, could be 1 month, it could be 3 months before they're able to recover. If we multiplied this 958 times 12 for 3 months, then we've lost $11 million. That has a significant impact on the cost benefit analysis. Because
Yeah.
if the expectation is that the worst case scenario is that the things that are critical to the operations of the business could be down for up to 90 days, that 90 days represents $11 million. Most solutions that enhance and increase resilience do not cost $11 million.
Yeah.
It might be $1 million investment, but then the logical question is it better to risk $11 million because you did not invest at all in resilience, or is it better to spend maybe $1, $2, or $3 million per year on average to protect your ability to continue to make $50 million a year? Given all the factors and considerations, option B is the best option.
Yeah.
Invest properly to reduce risk and enhance resilience, because not doing so could cause you to lose a significant amount that you can't recover, and not being able to recover is preventable.
especially if you consider that the difference between profitability and loss is for organizations anywhere between 5 to 20% of revenue. And if you spend that and you lose that productivity, you are operating in the red. That's impactful. Nobody's going to be happy. Your investors are not going to be happy. The people who are waiting for their bonuses aren't happy. The customers aren't happy. It impacts your business beyond the year that the incident took place. So then the thing that I often hear about that is yes, it is very impactful, these events, but they're not likely to happen. What do you say to that? Say to the company says, "Well, I don't want to spend $2 or $3 million per year to protect my $50 million revenue pipeline, because the chances of me running an incident is really not that big."
Yeah, I think that's bad risk analysis. What people tend to assume is that criminals specifically target specific businesses. The reality is that criminal enterprises operate as their own economy. You
Mm.
have different groups within the criminal enterprise that perform different activities, and everybody is incentivized for success. But nobody in the criminal groups has regulatory requirements that prevent them from being able to do anything. And so you have some people dedicated to compromising credentials. You have some people dedicated to gaining a foothold in an environment. And where enterprise companies might spend a significant amount on security controls, the small and medium businesses are easier to compromise. Once the criminal enterprises have access to the environment, those companies could be used to facilitate crime against other people. And so it's not just about protecting your own company and your assets and your interests, but it's really recognizing that all businesses operate in an ecosystem where a lot of people are connected to each other. So my responsibility is not just limited to what must I do to protect my interests in my company, but also what must I do to make sure that my company is not participating in drug trafficking, global espionage, terrorism, human trafficking, exploitation of children. I mean, all these horrible things are what people in the criminal enterprise are doing when they compromise a business environment. And so, if we're only thinking about, what's the bottom line revenue or income number that's affected if we have a security incident that I think is improbable, you're probably focusing on the wrong problems. The bigger picture is that every company that is not doing the right things for security is potentially contributing to victimization of other people in other places because your company's technology resources are being used to harm other people. And in a global business economy, that's not really the best mindset to take, that I'm not going to spend to protect myself and I'm willing to remain ignorant of the abuse that other people are realizing
Yeah,
because I'm unwilling to invest in my own protection.
yeah, yeah. That's indeed that, and also, of course, it is. Uh, Criminal enterprises, the business of criminal or criminality is very profitable, and it is growing. Global reach is growing. The access is there. Automation in criminal activity is there. So even from that perspective, the risk element is growing, and also again, indeed for SMBs as well. Dus SMBs, just like you said, Kean, SMBs can say, "Well, we're small. What is there for us for criminals to gain here?" Criminals might think the exact opposite. Well, they're small, so what are they going to invest in cybersecurity or any type of protection? So it might be easy to get in there. So from their perspective, the opportunity to try to reach into SMBs is a tempting opportunity. So
Yeah,
just
you
sorry, go
said
ahead.
try,
Yeah,
but I think the success rate
yeah,
for criminal attacks against small and medium businesses is probably much higher than the success rate of criminal attacks against large enterprises because we're talking about a significant difference in resources available to identify the threats, respond, and get them out of your environment if they get in there. Franz, the other thing that's interesting to consider is that if small and medium businesses, because of lack of awareness or lack of resources, don't invest a significant amount in protecting and locking down their environments, not only are they actually targeted by the criminal enterprises, but they're a much more valuable target because it's the small and medium businesses that serve the larger enterprises, which
Yeah.
is why for large enterprises, third party risk management is an important concern. Usually, large businesses that are compromised through the people that they're working with. Most of the people that they're working with are small and medium businesses.
Yeah.
And so the perception that I'm a small and medium business, so nobody's coming after me, is an incorrect perception based on the evidence that exists in the marketplace. Going all the way back to Target, when their environment was compromised through their heating and air vendor, not as a direct attack against Target itself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. And I have a small anecdotal story that I would like to insert here to highlight that. There was and this took place during COVID, the height of COVID. There was a apple processing farm located in apple farmland, and this processing plant collected all apples from different farmers, and their job was to clean the apples and distribute them to retail outlets, to grocery stores. They got hacked the night before Christmas, and it was a planned attack, and it was a family owned operation as well, and they were ready to celebrate Christmas. So the staff was on vacation. It was a low season for apple processing, and so everybody was focusing on family time and uh, uh, just celebrating the holidays, and they got hacked. And the interesting thing was that it is largely a factory type of process, but they have computers to optimize the factory processes. And it was the computers that got hacked. And these computers, because of the work that they do, are very expensive. And what they had to do was not only show resilience by doing the whole process of cleaning apples and distributing them to retailers. They had to do that manually and thereby give up their vacation. But they also had to throw away their computers completely because they couldn't figure out quickly enough where the hack was. And if the embedded malware, if they could clean it. So their equipment was untrustworthy. So they had to buy new equipment, spent over $1 million on that equipment, which of course they didn't have in their bank account. So they had to borrow money to do that, and then they had to get it from the factory. From the computer from IBM or whatever mainframe company was delivering it, had to get it to their plant, installed, operational, while working manually to process all the apples because their work was so influential to the farmers as well as to the retailers, the grocery stores. If they were not able to distribute apples, the grocery stores were not going to be able to sell them to their clients, and then the farmers wouldn't have any income. So the impact of what they were doing, and however small they thought of their risk exposure, it was extremely impactful upside and downside of the supply chain. And so they did, they did the hard work and recovered that. With that, they kept the trust of all the farmers and the grocery stores, and they kept their losses to a minimum. But they also had to learn the lesson in the hard way. So that's just an indication, and it's not necessarily you can say, well, that's not an SMB, but it is an SMB. It is lots of farms are SMBs. But anyway, so that's an anecdotal story. So if I put it in my if I step into the shoes of an SMB and I want to start become compliant or be more educated and more aware of it and really be on top of this situation, we talked about consultants and about doing it yourself or the combination of it. But where do you start? Say that you're indeed an SMB, $50 million in revenue, and you're the manager of the organization. Who do you assign and this task? And are there any tools or oh, processes that organizations can utilize to start?
Yeah, Franz, I would say that success starts with the leadership of the organization. Regardless of the size of the company, the people who lead the organization, those are actually the people who have a responsibility for saying what are the acceptable risks in the operation of this business. If we look at enterprise environments, they actually have a formal document that's called a risk appetite statement. And the risk appetite statement defines the risk that the company is willing to accept in pursuit of business outcomes. Now, what tends to happen is the risk appetite statement is decomposed and it identifies key risk areas, how the organization is going to respond to risk identified in those key areas, and it sets the framework and the approach for everybody else in the company to behave properly under certain circumstances. And so imagine, if you will, we had a formal risk appetite statement for a small business, so less than $50 million. But the risk appetite statement says that it is unacceptable for negligence in cybersecurity to lead to death or dismemberment of any person in our facility. Well, that statement by itself drives all of your behaviors and it drives your spending. We need to patch all of our physical systems so that the use of the physical systems doesn't become compromised, so that a compromised system doesn't lead to the death or dismemberment of somebody. And going through that process for all the key business risks starts to set boundaries. It starts to drive decisions that are made, but realistically, only the owners and the leaders of the business can make that decision. Once that decision is made, then management and staff within the business can start to gather information to verify, based on this risk appetite statement that we've documented, are we within the acceptable risk boundaries or are we exceeding the acceptable risk boundaries? And the answer to that question then drives the next step. If we're within boundaries, we just keep monitoring for the lifetime of the system and the business. If we see something that exceeds the boundary, then we have a risk event that occurs and we respond to it properly. If we exceed the boundary, exceeding the risk boundaries starts to inform who is the best partner, the best advisor, the best employee who can jump in and help us move from exceeds the boundary to operates within the boundary. Now, this might sound theoretical in practice, but I intentionally framed it that way so that anybody listening to this recording can use the information and apply it to their own company. And so a manufacturing company is going to have different risk than a textile company. A textile company is going to have different risk than a software as a service company. Software as a service is going to have different risk than a banking company. But if, regardless of the industry, fintech, textiles, manufacturing, software as a service, every business can have the leadership say, based on my declaration of my authority, this is the official documented boundary. How far are we willing to go? And then how far are we willing to go answers other questions that we'll talk about in this series. And so the risk appetite statement informs, do we adopt artificial intelligence? And under what circumstances is that acceptable? Do we put a formal privacy program in place, or do we just have a cookie on our public facing website because we don't really interact with individuals or a business to business organization? Every decision about risk is informed by the risk appetite statement, but outside the financial services industry, very few organizations even have one. If you're if you're live in the webinar, I'll put a link in the chat for the Financial Stability Board. They have a really good document that's public, freely available. I'm not selling anything, that focuses on the principles of an effective risk appetite statement. And that becomes an outstanding tool for any business of any size to get started. For those of you who listen to the recording later, if you just do a search, principles for an effective risk appetite statement, or I'm sorry, let me start over. your specific search terms in quotations. Principles for an effective risk appetite framework is what's going to be the document that you're looking for. The source of that information is the Financial Stability Board, and they have a PDF document that anybody can download to be able to find the answer to the question and build the preliminary tool that's going to contribute to success within your organization.
It's excellent, and thank you for posting that in the chat. That's excellent. But what I also appreciate of this conversation is that often enough organizations look at risk and compliance as a technical question, but you're stressing the importance of the organizational aspect, which therefore also emphasizes the human aspect. And my experience, and by all means, happy to be totally corrected, but my experience is that the biggest risk for organizations is the human element. That's the biggest central risk factor. Is that correct, or is there a lot more nuance to it?
No, it's people are the problem in every organization, and I say that with some humor in my heart. But what ends up happening is people configure technical controls. People make decisions about acceptable risk. People make decisions about doing things even when they know that they shouldn't do them. And all of this is based on the study of human psychology. And so if you agree that businesses are organisms represented by all the people that are working in the company, combining their knowledge, skills, and abilities to deliver whatever the organization promised, well, you have to have something in place to guide people to make decisions that are beneficial for the company rather than allowing people to make decisions that are in their own self-interest. And so my experience is primarily in enterprise environments, but in enterprise environments where the company doesn't have good policy, procedure, and enforcement mechanisms, people do whatever they want to do so they can get their bonus.
Yeah.
That is sustainable in large enterprises because they generate much more revenue and they have a lot more runway to deal with the problems produced by bad organizational behavior. In a smaller business, that's much more difficult because you have less runway. A $50 billion business has more room for error than a $50,000 business. And so in a $50,000 business, you don't want one employee to make a $50 million mistake that's going to put the company out of business. And a $50 billion business, a $50 million mistake is inconvenient, but is not going to cause the expiration of the business per se. This kind of leads, Franz, into the question that we had about AI. I think AI is just a risk. We'll talk deeply about AI in a future segment, but AI doesn't make cybersecurity better or worse. AI highlights that you either have good or bad security practices within the company. And so AI under control can be very beneficial to an organization. AI implemented in an organization that has very little control and poor risk management is just going to make bad problems worse faster than you would have made them with a human involved. And so it's really a risk management question. Do we have the right system of internal controls to reduce risk to an acceptable level? I teach AI. I used to teach it at the university level. I teach it just for training, but the history of AI goes back thousands of years. The underlying principles of what we know in artificial intelligence today were conceived of millennia ago. And even for modern use, AI has been around since the 1950s. And so generative AI is new based on what was released back in 2022, if I remember the date correctly. But when I was at the CDC, we were using machine learning for multidimensional data analysis. And so it's very, very important that people and organizations, when they're addressing the risk part of the equation, and cybersecurity is included in that, you still have to go back to the principles that we mentioned at the beginning. Do I know what I have? Do I know what's important? Do I know how it works? And do I have the ability to bring it back when there's an outage? AI could contribute to or take away from success in that area. But the same thing could happen with encryption. The same thing could happen with employees clicking on phishing emails. The same thing could happen with somebody doing fraud in the corporate banking account and stealing $50 million just by writing themselves a check. We don't want to limit risk management to just technology issues. We do want to look broadly, especially for small and medium businesses, to say what is every risk. And then for every risk that we identify, what are the most important risks? And then for those most important risks, how do we implement the right controls to reduce those risks to an acceptable level? Under ideal circumstances, our risk appetite statement is going to help us answer a lot of those questions about how much risk is the right amount of risk for this company.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. And we have one other good question in the chat as well, which we can touch upon, but also with the promise of going deeper into this down the series as well. For SMBs, this is a very good topic. Larger enterprises tighten their vendor risk management requirements, which forces SMBs to uh, SMBs to adapt quickly to stay competitive and to be able to work with the larger companies. What are the most effective way for a small business to demonstrate indeed the security maturity required by larger clients and partners?
I'm going to put another tool in the chat that is a free tool. This applies to everybody in Global Chamber from a global perspective. So the tool comes from the United States, but the cybersecurity capability maturity model is possibly the best tool that allows a business of any size to measure the maturity of cybersecurity practices within the organization. It is a progressive model that has an all or nothing approach. If you look at the documentation, it describes what they call maturity indicator levels. But if you apply the model properly, there is no subjective answer about the maturity of the business. You've either met all the requirements for a specific level of maturity or you have not. If you haven't met the requirements, then your maturity level is 0 or it's a 1 or it's a 2. What this does is it causes or creates the opportunity for anybody to do an assessment and then come up with the same results as somebody else, regardless of their experience, because you're really just asking yes or no questions. Do you have an inventory of the data? Yes or no? Do you have an inventory of your IT infrastructure, of your OT infrastructure? As you go through all the questions for all 10 domains, any company can do a self-assessment to identify where they have gaps. And then based on those gaps, they can prioritize starting the process to search for vendors, partners, consultants to help them address the things that they found. A company is always going to be in a position of strength if you go to a vendor and say, hey, vendor, this is my problem. Can you solve it? Rather than going to a vendor or consultant and saying, hey, vendor consultant, can you tell me what my problem is? Yeah. Because option A always helps you find somebody that can solve a specific problem that you're dealing with. Option B subjects you to somebody selling you something that you don't need. It's something that you don't want and identifying problems that you didn't really care about. And so if we say that the primary responsibility for risk management belongs to the owner of the business, it's also valuable for the owner of the business to direct the use of a tool like the cybersecurity capability maturity model so that the company does its own internal assessment, establishes where it is, and then prioritizes how do they want to respond to the findings. My recommendation before we say farewell is that in the C2M2 model, maturity does not need to be at level 3. So level 2 is a good target for most organizations, regardless of their size. You start to run into issues with limited financial resources, where if you strive to be level 3 across all 10 domains, you're going to run out of money very quickly. But if you identify the things that are 0 and move them to 1, identify the things that are 1 and move them to 2, everything that's at level 2 is going to be reasonably appropriate for any company and any organization. And this is based on maturity, not compliance. So it's a good starting point to put organizations in a position for success.
Fantastic. Excellent. I think this is a great moment to start preparing for the next session in 2 months.
Yes, we must say farewell to the audience. We're 3 minutes over, but Franz, I'll say farewell first. I'll turn it over to you to close out. But for all of our Global Chamber members and guests, I appreciate you being part of this session. I assume people thought this was going to be a technology talk, but cyber risk is just business risk. It's a specific category, but it's really up to business people to make decisions about the risks that they face and how they're going to respond to it so that their companies can stay resilient. And this is the type of conversation that Franz and I will have for all 6 segments in the series as we provide content to our Global Chamber family throughout 2026. Franz, over to you to close it out.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Kian. Fantastic, really. I appreciate it and learned a lot, and I look forward to our next session in 2 months, where we will delve a little bit deeper into cybersecurity awareness in the workforce. How do you make sure that your organization, at the human level, at the human resource level, is aware of the risks and aware of how to prepare themselves and be alert to the risk that they're exposed to on a daily basis? We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much. Doug, would you like to say anything to close it out?
Do we have some dates for that, rough dates for the one for in 2 months?
Let me quickly check. I do believe we have it already on the calendar. That should be the same. So we have the cadence on Mondays in 2 months. So that will be April
27th.
Yeah.
Doug, generally it's the 4th Monday of the odd month.
Okay.
Yeah. Indeed, and I see it. It is not yet on the Global Chamber calendar, but we will make sure it is there within minutes.
Okay, very good. Yeah, Milo, that is one of the ones that we want to carry all the way through the year. So let's get that. We are making an adjustment in April, and kind of switching systems a little bit for the event committee. So over the next couple of weeks, we'll get that up and for the rest of the year. Thank you, gentlemen. Really great information. Super important for all SMBs to consider. And if you are listening to this conversation, or if you're live, of course, but if you're listening to this on video and you're having trouble getting in touch with either of the speakers today, let us know. info@globalchamber.org will get us and we'll get you into speaking with them and understanding more about your business. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.
Excellent. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, gentlemen.